Can I be honest about something that I know is going to raise some eyebrows? It's been over 5 years since Nintendo first released what is now one of their most financially successful pieces of video game hardware, subsequently redefining their short, albeit substantially weakened hold over the global video game console market. Within hours of its reveal, I believe just about anyone could have predicted that the Nintendo Switch had the potential to regain a chief piece of its market share that was lost in the prior generation, if not completely overtake the competition. Shifting focus from having to support two very different platforms, one of which was flourishing while the other floundered, to instead blend the best aspects of both into one hybrid console was genius. It was a natural next step for Nintendo, seeing that recent advancements in hardware capability allowed the Switch to remain both as powerful as their home consoles and as portable as their booming handhelds. I remember sitting outside a Target store on a freezing cold early March morning 5 years ago, waiting for the store to open just so I could get my hands on the Switch as soon as I possibly could. I often think about that moment when considering my time spent playing it over the last half-decade, because at the time, my excitement for a change of tides for Nintendo was immeasurable. The possibilities seemed endless. And so, it is a bit hard to come to terms with the fact that I think the Switch kinda sucks. And that's not to say I think the Switch wasn't a great idea. What it offers adjacent to its competitors is still incredible, and a textbook example of Nintendo's limitless potential when they find themselves ahead of the curve on the right trend. The numbers simply don't lie. However, somewhere along the line, the Switch quietly shifted from my go-to gaming machine to something I spend more time wiping the dust off of than actually playing. And I've been struggling to understand why. This isn't the first console cycle this has happened with either, and I'm sure it won't be the last, as my level of engagement with what Nintendo is currently offering ebbs and flows. But I still had to wonder, is there something more to this feeling than personal disinterest? Is Nintendo failing in some other way that isn't reflected in the sales data? Am I the only person that feels this way? After spending a lot of time thinking about what I find so disappointing about the Switch's life cycle, I realized that in order to really understand the core of the issue, I would have to consider things from a wider perspective, because disappointment most often comes from a place of unmet expectations. I do believe there are plenty of surface-level complaints to be made about the Switch that are valid, from its faulty controllers to its shoddy online infrastructure. But my issues with the console go beyond that. What bothers me most is seeing the many ways in which Nintendo has regressed compared to previous generations. That's why I decided to take a deeper look at Nintendo's immediate past, emerging from deep within the uncharted abyss of my dusty closet with some answers. I suppose now is as good a time as any to say that this isn't so much a video strictly about the Nintendo Switch itself as it is about another piece of hardware entirely. When I say I don't like the Switch, I think what I really mean to say is that I miss the Wii U. Or, at the very least, what the Wii U stood for. I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out. In spite of everything that caused the Wii U to become one of the worst performing pieces of video game hardware Nintendo has ever produced, when I look back on what it offered me, I feel more satisfied than I ever have since the launch year of the Switch. Perhaps more so than any other console generation. Nintendo's failure to exceed or even so much as match my expectations feels particularly disappointing given their past experiences. It's not even about just the console itself, but also their new approach to communication and their shift in identity as a platform. Examining the current state of Nintendo as a whole reveals unmet expectations to be a common theme, and in order for expectations to go unmet, they need to become established in the first place. Thus, taking a deeper look at what the Wii U offered is critical in understanding why I find the Switch disappointing. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Running contrary to the unequivocally poor marketing that left the average consumer wondering whether this machine was its own console or yet another accessory for the long since outdated Wii, the release of the Wii U was a bold statement. Nintendo was not about to go back to primarily targeting core gamers after their new Blue Ocean audience led the Wii and the DS to unprecedented levels of success. They didn't quite double down, but it was clear from the beginning that the Wii U's mission was to establish a solid middle ground within its user base by converting the casual into the enthusiast, beginning with its feature set. The Wii U made a considerable effort to become the centerpiece of the living room by supporting video streaming, internet browsing, video chat, and TV control a full year before its competition. But the main selling point was the gamepad. With the motion control fad on its way out and touch-based smart devices settling in, the Wii U gamepad was Nintendo's answer to what they believed was a growing problem with the burgeoning success of these devices and their dominance over countless families' homes. They had identified that while advancements in technology were making aspects of life more convenient and efficient, they were also causing people to feel more divided than ever before, even in the comfort of one's home. The solution was to create a device that would help unite people rather than divide them. And to do that, it had to be adaptable. The gamepad was thus designed to be the single most ambitious gaming peripheral ever conceived, doubling as both a tablet device and a traditional gaming controller equipped with a camera, microphone, NFC reader, TV remote functionality, and motion control through its gyroscopic sensor and accelerometer. It was a Frankenstein mess of a device, but at the time, the possibilities with which this controller could innovate made it unlike anything that had come before it. In a presentation just prior to E3 2012, the late president and CEO of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, laid this philosophy out in plain terms. He quoted Shigeru Miyamoto, stating that,
"A great idea solves the multiple problems at the same time."
In conjunction with this, a Japanese phrase Iwata described as loosely translating to
creating something unique.
These words exemplified not only the gamepad's functionality, but everything else the Wii U stood for, from its asynchronous game design to its online connectivity. Unfortunately for Nintendo, the average consumer that had long since packed up their Wii wasn't biting. And without a solid lineup of launch games meant to entice longtime fans and early adopters, Nintendo was left lacking support from both audiences they wished to converge. And it's from this position where things get really interesting. By no means was I an early adopter of the Wii U. In fact, for upwards of 6 months following its release, I didn't even know it existed. I think that speaks to a wider issue regarding its initial marketing or lack thereof, but regardless of that fact, I wasn't really in the position to be paying proper attention. Having grown up with classic Nintendo consoles that each featured a diverse lineup of colorful characters and franchises, the absence of new and exciting content drops among the sea of shovelware throughout much of the Wii's life cycle felt fairly alienating. But rather than feeling frustrated by a lack of new releases to look forward to, I felt like I had simply aged out of my interest in Nintendo, graduating to other platforms until I reached a point of complete disinterest in gaming as a whole. I can't say for certain when exactly the Wii U landed on my radar, but what I do know is that when it did, I quickly grew attached to the idea of grabbing one for myself because I simply wanted a reason to be excited about video games again. The launch lineup was still a problem, as I personally couldn't justify the cost just to play yet another side-scrolling Mario game. But luckily for me, the perfect excuse was just over the horizon. Pikmin 3 may not have been as attractive to the average consumer as a new 3D Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon game would have been, but it's the perfect case study to demonstrate why the early days of the Wii U's life were so exciting. It was certainly enough to entice me into rejoining the Nintendo ecosystem, and I loved it. There simply wasn't another game that could better demonstrate why the graphical refresh from Wii to Wii U was so important. While Nintendo was no stranger to pushing the limits of what was aesthetically possible with relatively underpowered hardware through their use of timeless art styles and graphical techniques, the jump to HD showed just how much better their games could look and how valuable that is to the overall experience. For better and for worse, Pikmin 3 pushed the limits of what was possible on Wii U, not only through its visuals but through its slew of new features and adherence to the console's mission statement. A great idea solves multiple problems at the same time. It would be disingenuous to suggest that the Pikmin series was predisposed to such problems, but it's hard to deny that the implementation of the gamepad's second screen alongside its motion controls didn't elevate the gameplay experience to an unprecedented level of polish. Pikmin 3 thrives as a time management simulator in a way previous entries in the series had yet to achieve. Adding an additional captain in the sequel lended well to more complex puzzle solving, but adding a third quite poetically encouraged players to juggle multiple different tasks at once. The gamepad's additional screen was poised to make that additional layer of complexity both intuitive and unobtrusive. Throughout the course of the Wii U's life, gamepad functionality was often criticized for being nothing more than supplemental. More often than not, the second screen wasn't the core focus of an experience. And I think Pikmin 3 makes a strong case for why this could actually be a good thing. During the main flow of play, the touchscreen displays several menus featuring additional information best sought during idle moments. But what made a real difference was the interactive map feed that allowed the player to quickly manipulate the pathing of another captain with a touch of the screen. It was comprehensive, showing captain and Pikmin locations, navigational waypoints, and even the staging of the environment. I can't imagine playing Pikmin 3 again without such a resource, and I'm willing to argue that the gamepad screen was the best placement for it because it was available at a glance while still remaining unobtrusive. Could Nintendo have simply added a mini-map as well as map functionality to the pause menu like they did in the Switch port? Of course. But because it was placed on the gamepad instead, players could quickly take a glance at it without interrupting play or while waiting for a group of Pikmin's action to complete. The mini-map was a serviceable solution, but there's no world where it could be as comprehensive as the gamepad without blocking off a huge portion of the screen. Pikmin 3 is an already great game made just a bit better by the fact that it was on Wii U, an interesting promise of how previously existing features could be further refined with the gamepad. Regrettably, it's also just one of only a handful of games that managed to strike the correct balance between leveraging the gamepad's capabilities or ignoring it entirely. It also wasn't a particularly long or challenging game. While I continued to spend some time chasing high scores in the challenge mode after completing the main story, I had exhausted Pikmin 3's supply of content fairly quickly, which left me in an interesting position waiting for new releases. Had this been, as it often has with the Switch, the console would rest completely idle until the launch of the next critically timed first-party release, or the odd event that a group of friends wanted to get together to play the latest Mario Kart or Smash Bros. Game. The Wii U was different, however, due to its effort to become the centerpiece of the living room. This manifested in a user experience built off the Wii's foundation that was fairly robust, especially in comparison to the Switch's interface. And for me, the lead up to the following holiday season was the perfect excuse to spend some time getting a little more acquainted with what the rest of the Wii U had to offer. Compared to the Switch's basic and straight-to-the-point home screen, the Wii U's hub felt a little more, Nintendo? It was instantly intuitive and recognizable to Wii owners, featuring full backwards compatibility with all Wii peripherals and software, upscaled to high resolution, perfect for the dry spells. I personally loved just browsing the Wii U's eShop. It seemed like every time the season changed, or even just randomly, new music that was oftentimes festive would accompany the sea of tiles recommending different categories of games to take a deeper look at based on your interests. And for a while, I was excited to check out the new Virtual Console offerings every week, even when what they were frustratingly drip-feeding wasn't anything special. It was all still simple, just more lively. Simply another opportunity for Nintendo to innovate where the competition was lacking. Seriously, I don't want to spend any second longer than I have to in this bland, laggy mess of a storefront. Nintendo even sparingly released these strange applications like the Animal Crossing Plaza which wasn't really a game at all, but more so a means of facilitating the system's social features, which finally brings me to the Miiverse. The Miis were still a cornerstone of Nintendo's ecosystem, and every time you powered on your Wii U, a swarm of them, presumably belonging to other players on the network, would rush from the top of the screen, echoing posts from their profiles on Miiverse, the Nintendo social network that was engineered to keep Wii U owners connected to each other from around the world. And I really enjoyed it. Like, don't get me wrong, Miiverse was a very weird place that is most commonly remembered for its romantic tragedies and cringe compilations. It's a natural consequence of creating a social network predominantly used by children, which could honestly be problematic in its own way. But even so, the early days of Miiverse were something special. Before the console's launch in 2012, Satoru Iwata stated that,
The purpose of Miiverse is to add not only information, but also a new degree of empathy between players.
And for a time, it absolutely achieved that. I have this oddly specific memory from the time I played Super Metroid for the first time on Wii U. Naturally, I'd reached a roadblock in which the solution was not readily apparent, but instead of banging my head against the wall or looking up the solution online, I decided to post a question paired with a screenshot on Miiverse. I ended up having a friendly interaction with a guy that, while not immediately knowing the solution himself, was able to walk me through the steps to figure it out for myself. I just as easily could have looked up the solution, which would have taken even less time, but there was something much more novel about that interaction. For a brief moment, it felt like the playground exchange of video game secrets and other information was being inserted back into my life with all of the convenience online services can provide. And this was really only the tip of the iceberg regarding the potential of Miiverse. Let me introduce you to a user simply named Wii U News. This guy was my Nibelian back in 2013. RIP, by the way. Constantly posting any and all Nintendo news and aggregate review scores for just about every new game release to Miiverse. But best of all, he ran these weekly high-score tournaments just for fun that dramatically extended my playtime with Pikmin 3 and other games, though many of those posts are lost in the wind. Miiverse also worked wonderfully with the gamepad, a natural evolution of the DS's PictoChat, with casual artists posting some fantastic pieces of their favorite Nintendo characters to the various boards dedicated to each game. The games themselves even incorporated Miiverse functionality, though some games were certainly more creative with it than others. Posting snapshots from Pikmin 3 to Miiverse, or snapping selfies to send off to complete strangers in the Tingle Bottle in Wind Waker HD was a fun little distraction. Sometimes Nintendo's developers would even post on Miiverse. One of the coolest things was logging into Miiverse every day to see the latest screenshots coming out of Super Smash Bros. Development, posted by Masahiro Sakurai himself. Even as a marketing tool, Miiverse was genius. For all the really weird stuff that was constantly being posted and dealt with by moderation, there was so much great content that I can't help but feel it's a bit of a shame it was outright shut down in response to the demands of moderating such a service while users were supposedly flocking to other forms of social media. What Miiverse had that other platforms don't was kind of a shield from all the manipulative tactics used to keep users doom scrolling. Instead, Miiverse was about joy scrolling. It absolutely was an echo chamber by and for Nintendo fans. And for the most part, that was great! A far cry from the toxicity of Twitter debate lords and the outright brain rotting enabled by other platforms. It was innocent until people ruined it, something I can't really fault Nintendo for taking action on. I understand why they canned it, but for what it was, Miiverse was a pretty cool experiment. It certainly was an interesting way to keep players connected, even when the games themselves did not.
Even in a single-player game, even where players are not competing or cooperating at the same time, even when the games are not designed for online interaction, Miiverse can connect your living room with those of others, regardless of space or time.
That was another interesting caveat to to owning a Wii U. Beginning with Pikmin 3's release in August, the back half of 2013 was probably the best time to pick up a Wii U as the release calendar finally began heating up. I took chances on some great games I would normally be more hesitant on, like the wonderful 101 and Rayman Legends. Hell, for as much of a hot mess as it was, I got a ton of enjoyment out of Sonic Lost World, chasing leaderboard spots for the quickest times. There were some solid first-party offerings too, like Super Mario 3D World and the Wind Waker HD when Zelda remasters were still a novel concept, followed by Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze and Mario Kart 8 rolling into 2014. Just how the console was originally intended, multiplayer became a big focus of the Wii U's first-party lineup. With the additional screen on the gamepad and support for seemingly every controller released since the launch of the Wii, it made a ton of sense. But to the dismay of many players, online play was either middling at best or, in classic Nintendo fashion, missing in action. Mario Kart 8 was a standout favorite, evident by the amount of hours I was putting in, but games like Pikmin 3, Tropical Freeze, and 3D World didn't really utilize the gamepad screen to enhance the multiplayer experience, and online play wasn't an option at all. At the time, I didn't understand why Nintendo was making these frustrating decisions, but I think I do now. More on that later. In any case, the games continued to trickle in, probably not as fast as they needed to, but still trickling nonetheless. Hyrule Warriors was such a cool proof of concept, an interesting take on what Nintendo's collaborations could look like in the future. This was followed up by the long-awaited Bayonetta 2, and interesting smaller side projects like Yoshi's Woolly World, Kirby and the Rainbow Curse, and Captain Toad's Treasure Tracker. This game actually rips! Hell, the release of Splatoon was huge, Nintendo's first new IP in ages, and Super Mario Maker became a global phenomenon for some time. Perhaps ironically, so much of the framework for the Switch's lineup was established by the creativity and experimentation the Wii U fostered. The absolute pinnacle, however, was undoubtedly Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. God, that name is still awful. Topping the charts in all respects, the release of Smash 4 was an event. Whether they were picking it up on Wii U or even 3DS due to its crazy dual-release strategy, I don't know another Nintendo fan that wasn't excited for it, as the hype machine was insane, and the game certainly delivered. Smash 4 made an arguably larger leap for the series than even Ultimate did, course-correcting after many of Brawl's mistakes. It looked great, sounded fantastic, and played just like I envisioned it would, with a considerable increase in speed, resting somewhere comfortably between Brawl and Melee. The only thing really holding it back was the dual release strategy, as this entry featured a quantity of new stages that was frankly unheard of, yet separated between versions. It also would have been nice to play Smash Run on Wii U, but alas, I still played the hell out of Smash 4 because the ever-omniscient Nintendo, likely keeping a side glance at the overwhelming passion and speculation from fans across the internet and even on their own social media service, knew exactly how to market this game. Thanks to a genius new marketing strategy devised by Nintendo, the hype for every single new character reveal was out of this world, and it was a magical time to be along for the ride. We're about to take a turn, aren't we? If there was ever a hot take that would bring my credibility into question, it's gotta be this one. Oh well. Say it with your chest, Wizzy. I hate what Nintendo Directs have become, and here's why. On February 17th, 2021, Nintendo returned to the world stage to present their first full-length Nintendo Direct presentation since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic a full year prior. While multiple smaller presentations focused on Nintendo's third-party partners or single properties alone filled the gaps in 2020, this presentation was different. Instead of being accompanied by qualifying taglines like Mini Direct or Partner Showcase, this presentation was merely branded as Nintendo Direct. In other words, the big one. While fan expectations began to erupt after months of dormancy regarding all manner of outlandish predictions, there was one thing undoubtedly on everyone's mind. What's happening with the sequel to The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild? The presentation itself was middling at best. It was long, but not in a good way. First-party announcements were in short supply. Supplemented by some standout RPGs and multi-platform games, the Switch has since become synonymous with, among others. As we entered the final stretch, just in time for Shinya Takahashi's trademark One More Thing, Eiji Aonuma, the director for what is likely one of the most anticipated games in Nintendo history, appeared over a black backdrop to reveal what I can only describe as one of the most puzzling PR moves I've ever witnessed Nintendo make. The One More Thing is a classic marketing tactic used by Nintendo since long before the Nintendo Direct presentation ever existed. Outside of the one or two things that directly appeal to any particular viewer's interest, the average viewer only really remembers the opening and closure of a presentation. By saving the biggest and most unanimously appreciated announcement for the very end, the vast majority of viewers leave on a generally positive note. And by framing this final announcement as somewhat of a surprise bonus, the expectations for such become exceptionally high. In this particular moment, as almost 2 whole years had passed since the last teaser trailer had been revealed, Eiji Aonuma subverted those expectations by announcing there would be no announcements for Breath of the Wild sequel until later that year, softening the blow of immense disappointment by offering an enhanced Switch port of the Wii's Skyward Sword in the meantime. It was at this point I realized that in the time since the pandemic's outbreak, Nintendo's ability to effectively communicate with fans had straight up regressed because they know how important the One More Thing is to the reception of these presentations. They had been relying on Smash and other big first-party announcements to end these with for years. It's one thing to end on a largely enhanced version of Skyward Sword. I'll give it to them, that's actually pretty hype. It's another to give the viewer whiplash, moving from excitement to disappointment to excitement all over again in a matter of 30 seconds. This move was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me. It got me wanting to figure out why such a minute detail would so easily infuriate me, and why it feels like so many people leave a Nintendo Direct so frustrated and disappointed. What I realized by doing some digging was that this moment was really just a culmination of a much more gradual shift in Nintendo's approach to communication. And the reason I know this is because over the past month, I watched every Nintendo Direct since the Wii U's launch to see how they've changed. Ah, shit. I'm becoming one of those channels now, aren't I? Anyway, the first Nintendo Direct was released as far back as 2011, meant to communicate Nintendo's plans for upcoming consoles and game releases directly to their fans, largely off the back of the late Mr. Iwata. And before long, this strategy would change how video game announcements would be delivered forever. Before the dry spells, omniscient PR voice, and reaction farming back-to-back-to-back trailer rotations, Nintendo Directs felt quite a bit different. The format was similar, yet much rougher around the edges. There's no better installment to demonstrate this than the one I've already featured here a few times, releasing just days before Nintendo's 2012 E3 presentation. Unless you're an absolute dork for Nintendo history like I am, it's nothing special. Featuring nothing more than a static shot of Iwata in a company boardroom, telling the audience what to expect from E3 while communicating some of the Wii U's features and mission statements. Pretty boring, right? It's certainly nothing flashy like the presentations we've come to expect, but it captures an element that I feel has gone a bit missing from modern Nintendo Directs: the quality of the communication. The format continued to be refined following the release of the Wii U, incorporating the bombastic trailers for both first and third-party projects Nintendo fans have come to rave over. But even when Nintendo didn't have much to show, Iwata and Nintendo's developers still communicated interesting details regarding upcoming games. One of my favorite Nintendo Directs aired on January 23rd, 2013. For what it is, this presentation could just as easily never happened had Nintendo been following their current approach to Nintendo Directs. The first half of it doesn't even feature any gameplay footage, instead beginning with Iwata sharing post-launch update plans for Miiverse, the Wii U, and its Virtual Console. The latter half, however, is where things get a little more interesting, but not in the way one might expect. A behind-the-scenes look at Bayonetta 2 is followed by a few small verbal updates regarding Smash, a new 3D Mario game, and Mario Kart, which were all still in development and yet to be revealed. This presentation even features an exceedingly rare for Nintendo behind-the-scenes look at what would eventually become Yoshi's Woolly World. In what is clearly some early alpha footage, Iwata showcases this transformation from a single strand of yarn to a fully crocheted Yoshi that was cut from the final game. Before it's all capped off with its own One More Thing, an awe-inspiring Xenoblade Chronicles X reveal trailer, Eiji Aonuma appears in what I can only describe as a parallel universe version of our previous scenario, sharing candid thoughts on his development philosophy regarding what would eventually become Breath of the Wild, while offering consolation for its lengthy development with the Wind Waker HD reveal via screenshots. The announcements are scarily similar. The difference is the response to expectation and the quality of the communication. While fans are always expecting a new Legend of Zelda game to be in development, at this point, no info had been released regarding Zelda on Wii U, leaving Nintendo a few options with which they could handle the passing of information. They could have easily said nothing, or worse, tell the audience what they couldn't show. Instead, they decided to peel back the development curtain to talk openly about their considerations for the next game and how they had been unable to implement such philosophies in Skyward Sword. My big problem is that Nintendo has since taken the show don't tell mantra far too literally to the point of considerable disappointment in some more extreme cases. To be clear, the Nintendo Directs that followed the Switch's release weren't particularly bad by a reasonable definition. In fact, they're pretty similar in format to the Directs of old, with significantly refined presentation and pacing. They do, however, represent a shift in Nintendo's identity as a platform, because the thing that has changed is the content of the announcements. Nintendo Directs during the Wii U era were simply dominated by first-party properties demonstrated in the previous example because the system was such a headache to develop for or port to that it wasn't really receiving much third-party content in the first place. The Switch, on the other hand, is the most attractive platform for third-party publishing Nintendo has released probably ever, at least since the SNES, because it offers something that both the developer and the consumer can get behind, something no other platform can, at least until recently, that is. Portable play for fully fledged home console games. As such, modern Nintendo Directs have grown to reflect this, flooded with any and all manner of multi-platform games. And I think this is why many longtime Nintendo fans like myself most often walk away from the latest Nintendo Direct with frustration and disappointment. The truth is, these presentations are carried by the sea of multi-platform trailers because Nintendo doesn't release enough first-party software to fill a 40-minute presentation using their show, don't tell approach. That's why so much of the Directs of old were purely verbal explanations of games that would pop up in several presentations before launch, each revealing a little bit more information than the last. It's also why I think Nintendo's current approach straight up sucks. Like, let's be completely honest with ourselves here. When you watch a Nintendo Direct, not a partner or indie showcase, a Nintendo Direct, the big one, what are you expecting to see? I do believe that getting more eyes on independent projects is a great thing, but in all honesty, I think stuffing so many of these multi-platform games into a Nintendo Direct actually does a massive disservice to many of them that are great, because unless I'm taking notes, I'm not, or I'm already anticipating one of these games releasing on the Switch, I'm not, but that's a whole nother topic we'll get into soon, I'm not going to remember any of them by the time they release. I do remember Pikmin 4 being announced. I don't remember 2016's Factorio receiving a Switch port. I'm sorry. With trailer after trailer after trailer, there's not enough time to establish why I should be interested in these games. What time is allowed is only enough for a few blurbs of sanitized PR speak. That's why I prefer Nintendo's old approach so much more, where modern Nintendo Directs feel like an advertising spread in a magazine. The presentations of the Wii U era feel more like a monthly newsletter, a genuine attempt to communicate directly. This Wii U Direct in January 2013 was not an outlier. It was the standard, followed up by 9 more presentations within the year at a rate of almost 1 per month, each taking the time to further develop a war chest of projects. Now, I'm not saying Nintendo needs to have a Direct every month. That's obviously on the other extreme end of the spectrum. But what should be noted is the effect following a semi-frequent and consistent schedule can have. These presentations felt like a more casual and direct line of communication between developer and player. Their frequency ensured fans' expectations would not grow wildly out of control. And even if a game's initial reveal didn't leave a strong first impression, there were several more opportunities to see it in action. This is one of the key advantages online presentations have over in-person press conferences. Nintendo had correctly identified that the convenience of online video streaming would allow them to communicate with their fans far more efficiently than a single E3 press conference per year ever could. It made me feel more involved in Nintendo's ecosystem, so much so that I ended up taking chances on several games that may have missed my interest during their initial reveals, like Captain Toad, Xenoblade X, and Splatoon. And thus far, I haven't even taken into account how entertaining some of these directs were on their own. Like, even though the idea was an absolute flop, who doesn't remember the year of Luigi? And holy shit, who could possibly forget 2014 and 2015 Nintendo E3? It's actually frustrating to look back on these, because to me, it doesn't get any better than this. And no, I'm not talking about robot chicken animations or Star Fox puppets, although those are pretty sick. What I'm talking about is this. Instead of putting developers on a brightly lit stage with hundreds of eyeballs staring them down, trying to communicate with the audience while the real-time demonstration is malfunctioning, Nintendo sat their developers down in a room, sometimes in front of a green screen and maybe with Iwata behind the camera, and told them to talk about why they believe their game is compelling in their own words. It's simply an interview format. They're not awkwardly reading off a teleprompter. They react naturally, cracking jokes and laughing while communicating their passion for their work. Questions from previous directs are even answered, like how that Yoshi transformation became the basis for Woolly World's entire aesthetic. With a fully 3D environment to work with, Goodfeel could add a ton more detail, incorporating fully crocheted character models as opposed to the single strand of yarn Kirby was afforded. I'm gonna be honest, when I re-watched every Nintendo Direct, most of it was on 1.5 speed and with a whole lot of scrubbing. But when it came to these E3 presentations, I was absolutely feasting on the content, smiling the whole way through, and I think it's absolutely criminal that Nintendo hasn't found a way to incorporate this style of content delivery into their regular Nintendo Directs. The only developer that doesn't feel like he's being held on an increasingly tight leash is Masahiro Sakurai. And that's probably because he isn't actually a Nintendo employee. It's painfully ironic because Sakurai absolutely carries many of these presentations just by being himself. When Sakurai talks, people listen. The man is idolized by his community, so much so that the launch of his personal YouTube channel dedicated to sharing exactly the type of information I'm advocating for here has been widely successful. People want to hear this type of stuff. What Nintendo seems to not realize on their own is that having Yoshiaki Koizumi conduct a train of video game trailers is not nearly as impactful as sitting him down to say what he thinks about his own games. Much like Mr. Sakurai, he's a legendary developer I want to learn more about. These behind-the-scenes looks have become increasingly rare for Nintendo, and you can tell they enjoyed putting them together. They got creative and weird to a degree we may not ever see again, and I get it. It's gotta be hard to match that level of energy when the company's most forward-facing figures are exceedingly busy or even retired. former president of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, describes himself as an industry disruptor. He challenges industry conventions to deliver what he believes is the best product. Reggie was not only an expert marketer, but also a leader who broke down cultural barriers to get to the right decision. And I think he understood that passion is infectious. He's since gone on record stating that when fans yearn for the days in which Nintendo's developers were more forward-facing, they may be asking the wrong question, further explaining that his own role as a spokesperson was a moment of time need that the world has since moved on from. Maybe he's right, as the Switch's sales data would certainly suggest, but I still believe wholeheartedly that line of communication, that reverence and trust was what helped set Nintendo apart from their competition. As they have strayed further and further from that direction, Nintendo has begun to feel more and more like just a business than it ever has. The ramification of such a shift may not be felt in the immediate present, but it's all the while setting a concerning trend for the future. Above all, it's crystal clear that the late, great Satoru Iwata was a driving force behind these strategies. Iwata clearly approached communication with Nintendo fans carefully and creatively. He championed the preservation of industry history through his incredible Iwata Asks interview series, perfecting the format in these beautiful developer story segments. He loved displaying the passion in video games. I don't know, man. I just love passion. I miss the passion. Before I get too far ahead of myself, let's shut the door on Wii U. When I look back on my time with the Wii U, I find myself coming back to one particular game I never imagined would become one of my all-time favorites, Nintendo Land. Nintendo Land is my favorite Wii U game because it captures every aspect of Nintendo I love. It pays homage to many of Nintendo's enchanting properties through not just its wide selection of games, but also its overall theming, bringing the Nintendo theme park to the living room, complete with various attractions and decorations showcasing their rich history. I spent countless hours perfecting my skills in Donkey Kong Crash Course, completing all of its boards before hopping over for a quick round of Octopus Dance or Captain Falcon's Twister Race. Even today, revisiting Nintendo Land for this video instilled in me a new appreciation for the single-player attractions I largely ignored back then, like Balloon Trip Breeze and Yoshi's Fruit Cart. Jeez, when did Yoshi's Fruit Cart become so fun? The only reason I haven't played more of Takamaru's Ninja Castle is because every time I do, I get so into it that my wrist feels like it's about to fall off. Best of all though, were the multiplayer attractions, due in large part to their asynchronous design made possible only by the gamepad. Nobody ever gives Nintendo credit for solving the screen peeking issue because they're probably the only AAA developer that still believes in split screen play. Just like Wii Sports before it, it didn't matter whose hands I put the controller in. I could invite my high school friends over who had absolutely no interest in Nintendo, and we would spend hours hoofing it in Mario Chase or our personal favorite, Luigi's Ghost Mansion. Both such simple but fun games thanks to the gamepad. I have this very specific memory of having to watch over this kid whose mother was a friend of my mom. He must have been no older than 7 or 8, and he was so shy I was almost at a loss of what to do. I put a Wii remote in his hand and booted up Pikmin Adventure, and we had an absolute blast. Every time his family returned to visit after that, this kid was practically pounding on my door, begging to play Nintendo Land. And even though the shitlord teen in me was so annoyed, I couldn't help but crack a smile once we began playing because I loved this game just as much as he did. The fact is, the Wii U was a better social machine than the Switch could ever hope to be, even if it was tragically ignored by the exact audience it was meant to attract. While the games that did embrace online play without technical hiccups and quality of life issues were few and far between, that didn't stop Nintendo from making so many of the Wii U's games accessible and fun for whole families and social gatherings, regardless of anyone's own proficiency with gaming. Because that's what it was supposed to do. Think about it. Its Mario games were grounded in cooperative multiplayer, and some even allowed an additional player to provide support in an unorthodox yet all the while intuitive way. First few games the Wii U did receive, it sure did receive a ton of party games. Hell, the premier Smash Bros. Game at the time included an unprecedented 8-player mode that was actually feasible because the Wii U supported nearly every damn Nintendo controller under the sun. And if you had a Wii, you didn't have to break the bank to even try it. I actually played 8-player Smash with my 3DS as a controller, and it was so uncomfortably goofy. But I didn't care, because it worked. I was just happy to see everyone playing together and having fun. With the Wii U, I was able to share experiences with others that simply weren't possible with any other piece of hardware. And that aspect was not even limited to my pre-existing relationships. Through Miiverse, I was able to extend the life of my games, and I could organically tap into the communal aspects of gaming that became so much less personal in the age of the internet. In many ways, the Wii U was a culmination of Nintendo's efforts to cultivate a community, as Miiverse connected individuals who didn't have family or friends to enjoy their favorite hobby with. I even put more hours into my Wii U than I do any of my current generation devices because Nintendo's earnest approach to communication inspired me to. Even if the Wii U's life was cut tragically short due to lack of interest and poor sales, I didn't care because it provided me with immense value while succeeding in its mission to create something unique. The Switch, on the other hand, is just okay. It is undoubtedly a unique console that provides value to countless players across the world. In the midst of a global pandemic, many of its decisions have certainly come in clutch. I mean, who wasn't playing Animal Crossing in 2020? However, in many ways, the Switch feels like a huge initial leap forward, followed by a series of much smaller, agitating steps back. Its launch year was simply incredible, releasing 2 of the most critically acclaimed games of the last decade from Nintendo's 2 most critically acclaimed franchises. You just can't beat that. But ever since then, and with sparing exception, Nintendo has taken their foot off the gas in favor of letting third parties make up the bulk of the user's experience. I'm not here to argue that Nintendo isn't releasing the types of games I want, but what I will argue is that the quantity and quality of what they are putting out is lacking in a way I didn't really expect. One of the most common complaints echoed by countless fans throughout the Wii U era was that Nintendo's responsibility to support 2 different platforms prevented them from realizing the Wii U's full potential. Thus, the pivot to a hybrid console was believed to be a huge win for both Nintendo and the consumer. While Nintendo could continue to reap the rewards of their dominant ongoing handheld console line, all of their resources could be focused on just one platform to create more new games, both of larger and smaller scope, than ever before. For the first time ever, the consumer would only have to invest in one platform to gain access to all of Nintendo's upcoming games. There was a huge opportunity here to not only attract new users, but to get them invested in Nintendo's future products by getting them in front of the characters and games enthusiasts love. But they haven't done enough. The Switch does in fact have many first-party games featuring a wide array of Nintendo properties, but after accounting for the amount of ports it has received, courtesy of Wii U, its library of new and original ideas becomes a hell of a lot smaller and even on par with the previous console. I'm really conflicted about these ports, because on one hand, I'm glad that those that skip the Wii U can have the same experiences I did. But without any sort of upgrade path, I feel pretty disrespected for having supported them in the first place. If I want to experience their enhancements and new features, I have to shell out for the full cost of a game I've already played, and as such, I've skipped out on almost all of them. What remains is still a fairly large variety of Nintendo properties, but much of what is being represented here is beginning to experience some serious franchise fatigue because the external development teams that produce them are having to make up for the lack of content coming out of Nintendo's own development centers. Fire Emblem, Kirby, Pokemon, all these series are handled by external partners that, for the most part, don't have access to Nintendo's other IPs. It's simply most profitable for them to continue pumping out these games, so much so that many of them haven't exactly evolved the same way some of Nintendo's in-house franchises do. What is coming out of Nintendo internally has been viewed as uncharacteristically unrefined by their own standards, where some games are suffering from a lack of content at release, presumably due to rushed development. Others are seen as downgrades from fans who follow these series closely. Nintendo's communication isn't really doing these games much justice either, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to discern what is a well-polished product and what is a cash grab. In terms of first-party software, one could argue that not much has changed since the Wii U. And that's exactly the problem, because where the Switch hasn't improved all that much, it has also erased a lot of what the Wii U did to stand out from its competitors. The elimination of Miiverse is just the most straightforward example of a wider shift in identity Nintendo has adopted since the Switch's arrival. Ever since the Nintendo 64, the defining feature of Nintendo's home consoles has been couch multiplayer, whether it be casually knocking down pins with your dad or driving friendships to the brink in high-stakes Mario Party games or Smash lobbies. This is what Nintendo's Blue Ocean audience sticks around for. It's why Mario Kart has historically been Nintendo's best-selling series, pushing even more units than Pokemon. And every console preceding the Switch has been damn good at it. The Switch, however, just isn't as interested in evolving the multiplayer experience as what came before it. It was marketed as such, but in practice fails to do so because it's really not that fun to huddle around a tiny screen. And if I'm lugging my console, dock, cables, and controllers to a friend's house, is it really that much more portable than most other consoles? I've certainly had some unforgettable moments, like the time I played Puyo Puyo Tetris propped up on a suitcase at the airport before having to say goodbye to a dear friend. But moments like those are few and far between. Even those couch multiplayer moments that should be the sweetest are soured, because for the first time since I can remember, their controllers just don't work, and they're expensive as shit, too. That wasn't the case on Wii U. In many small but noticeable ways, this console feels like less of a Nintendo product than anything that came before it. Its storefront sucks. Its UI is bland. Its online infrastructure still sucks, even after we began paying for it. And the state of its legacy content is even worse than the Wii U, which was already seen as a downgrade from the Wii's Virtual Console. The one thing it really is good at, being the first go-to device for playing indie games on the go, isn't all that interesting to me because these games most often perform way better on my PC. And with Valve making moves into the handheld space with the backing of Steam, I don't see Nintendo being the dominant player there for too much longer. I should probably reiterate that I don't hate the Switch. At least, I certainly don't want to hate it, as there absolutely have been some flashes of brilliance. Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey have been two of my favorite games of the last decade, and the release of Metroid Dread has been a huge step in what I believe is the right direction for Nintendo. Not only was the game fantastic and felt tailor-made for the Switch, it was released in a state of transparency, with longtime series director and producer Yoshio Sakamoto answering decade-old questions that played a pivotal role in ballooning my excitement for its release. More of that, please! Pokemon is also finally beginning to shake things up, and in spite of Tears of the Kingdom's delays, Zelda fans have been feasting to a degree that has not been matched since the GameCube. It's just that, as the presumed end of the Switch's life creeps ever closer, after taking the time to compare my entire console libraries side by side, after re-experiencing the Wii U's games and its features as they once were, after rewatching far too many Nintendo Directs to see how things have changed, I think I just expected a bit more from the system that is by design what the Wii U should have been. When I have countless devices in my home vying for my attention, I know this is going to sound crazy, but stick with me here. The game releases themselves are but a portion of what drives confidence and passion in a video game console. An incredibly sizable portion, but a portion nonetheless. I cannot come up with any good reason for Nintendo abandoning their charming features and UI other than to pivot away from what failed as hard as possible. Without features like Miiverse, I strangely feel like less of a part of the Nintendo community than I once did. I can't say that without laughing, but it's true. It's also true that most people probably only play a handful of games for each system they own, and that is fine for them. But at this point in my life, I want to feel like the console itself is trying to draw me back in. I want my console to drag me away from my computer, and frequent communication that drums up excitement without diluting the message is a great way to do that. The worst part about all of this is that moving away from why I love Nintendo and what I know countless others love about Nintendo worked. Quite critically, a lot of what the Switch has erased is likely a response to copious amounts of feedback. But as a power user that has played every single Nintendo console since birth, I can't help but kind of feel forgotten. There's a phrase I've been using to describe my perspective for far longer than the Switch has been around. A struggling Nintendo is a creative Nintendo. I think what I've come to realize in an attempt to more deeply understand why Nintendo makes certain decisions is that in spite of the global recognition of their iconic characters and games, Nintendo is a hardware manufacturer first and a software developer second. They understand that software drives hardware sales, but almost every decision they make is a response to how well their consoles are performing at the time. While the GameCube lacked the type of hardware innovation Nintendo has become synonymous with, its library was pumped with some of the strangest spins on core concepts we've ever seen, up until its unceremonious abandonment. The Wii's pivot to a blue ocean strategy was a direct response to the GameCube's failure, but with its cultural explosion came this period of hubris and complacency, an unenthusiastic lull in software releases up until its successor failed to recapture the market's attention due to that hubris. The Wii U's attempt to course correct led to some of my favorite games being released in this 2 to 3 year period where the pressure was on to save it, and as such, Nintendo put their foot on the gas. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think I love the Wii U because it was struggling. The Switch, on the other hand, feels comparable to the Wii in this way. It's entirely possible that a global pandemic completely disrupted their plans to further capitalize on the Switch's immense install base. Maybe Nintendo is only now able to gear up their development capabilities for the next generation thanks to the Wii U's losses being recouped by the Switch. It's also possible that a void in leadership has thrown a wrench into their ability to effectively communicate with fans like me. Or maybe I really have begun to age out of Nintendo's offerings like I thought I did all those years ago. Whatever the case may be, even though I can't predict the future, I'm a little worried about what's coming next. Historically, Nintendo's successes have been followed by complacency before a complete and utter failure. And I believe we're in that period of complacency as the Switch has inherited many of the same issues the Wii U faced while seemingly erasing a lot of Nintendo's DNA that made me believe in it. Call me selfish if you want, but even if I am the only person who feels this way, with whatever is coming next, I hope we can all feel satisfied. And to do that, Nintendo needs to recapture the fire to deliver on all fronts. Maybe a better phrase is that a Nintendo that is challenged is one that delivers.